I hear traffic on the 405 is really bad today, so give people a minute more to get here, and then we'll get started.
Bob Bowen, I keep thinking MacUser is like another last name of yours, but then I just realized it's Mac User.
Okay. All right.
Okay, in the interest of time, let's get started. Welcome to Messy Conversations. I'm David Tripp. I'm on the faculty in Los Angeles, Antioch, Los Angeles. And we're really happy to welcome you to this edition of Messy Conversations. It's our quarterly book club. And yeah, we're very excited about that. A couple of quick announcements to knock out. If you're at all concerned about your internet privacy with Messy Conversations, feel free to not turn on your camera. And also you can change your name as it appears in some of the settings someplace. So feel free to do that. And then we want to briefly pitch two upcoming Messy Conversation events. Next week will be our final Messy Conversation for the quarter, for the spring quarter. We'll start up again in summer, so keep your eyes open for that. We usually start the second week of the quarter, so somewhere in the early mid-July we'll be back. And next week will be the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of agents of the state. And so we will be devoting the Messy Conversation to that. We're really lucky to have Patrick Jefferson rejoin us, and he'll be leading a conversation with a couple of other Black men around the Floyd anniversary. So be here for that. They're calling it Before He Was George Floyd, and a flyer will be going out for that soon. So that's next Monday, 4 o'clock. And then we're going to have an extra special Messy Conversation this Friday. And I want to ask Asa Wilder, who's been the lead in putting this together, to say a quick word about the special conversation this coming Friday. Asa?
Thanks, David. And I would say co-lead with Lisa, who's done a lot of the last minute organizing as well. But Lisa just posted a flyer in the chat for everyone. But this Friday at 4 p.m., so the normal Messy Conversation time, we're going to host a conversation looking at what is happening in Palestine, Israel right now. We're titling it Towards Justice in Palestine. And we have a conversation planned that it's going to be moderated by Dr. Zari Hedayat. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name right. And then we've just confirmed one conversationalist, Samer Badawi, who has covered, he covered the conflict in Gaza in 2014 and is a Palestinian child of refugees. And we really, I think this was spurred just by what was happening at the time, and this idea of messy conversations. I think it's really in the in the spirit of the goals of these conversations, to take these issues on head on, and also make some connections between anti-racist struggles that are happening in the United States and other struggles happening globally. And so I hope you all will join us. And we are also in the early stages of planning for a part 2 that will include the voices of probably looking to include the voices of Jewish Americans and diasporic Jews looking at this issue as well. So would love input and your attendance.
Thank you so much, Asa, and Lisa as well, for being provocateurs to get this before us and to do all the background work that you need to do to pull this off. We want to be as responsive as we can to what's going on in the world at Messy Conversations. And I know this is not on our usual day. It'll be Friday, this coming Friday, but hopefully you can attend, and feel free to pass the flyer along to others who would be interested in this issue. So with that, let's switch gears to our book club. As you can see from Clarence's background and Kathryn's background, we're doing Blain and Kendi's 400 Souls, or at least 5 chapters of it. And let me quickly introduce our conversationalists, our lead conversationalists. Kathryn Pope. Kathryn is on the faculty in the Undergraduate Studies Program, where she teaches writing courses. She is a graduate of the MFA program in Los Angeles, and more recently also earned an MA in urban sustainability here in Antioch, Los Angeles. And she's a longtime director of the Bridge Program and is currently in a co-director role with Russell Thornhill of the Bridge Program. So we're very happy to have Kathryn. And joining her will be Clarence Williams. And Clarence is graduating from the Undergraduate Studies Program. So he's a student here at Antioch and has begun the MA in Urban Sustainability Program himself. Has a strong activist background and engaged with a wide range of communities with a special passions for culture and the arts. And most recently, those passions expanding to include eradicating health disparities among minority populations. And he's been a consistent and longtime supporter of the Messy Conversations. So we're very, very glad to have him as one of our conversationalists today. So take it away.
Clarence, could you unmute yourself? Clarence, could you unmute yourself?
Okay, well, I guess that was rehearsal. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. We're made of so much water, bodies of water, bodies walking upward in the mud at the bottom, the mud they must call nighttime. Oh, there was some survival, life, after life on the Atlantic, this present grief, so old we see through it, so thick we can touch it. And Jesus said of his wound, go on, touch it. I don't have the reach. I'm not qualified, I can't swim or walk or handle a hoe or kill a man or write it down, a list of all we lost. This history of the wound, the history of a wound that somebody bought them, that somebody brought them to the shore of Virginia and then to the inland. I'd like to write a list of all we lost. Think of those who landed in the Atlantic. Think of the life after life on the Atlantic. Sweet Jesus, a grief so thick I could touch it. And Jesus said of his wound, go on, touch it. But I'm not qualified. I don't have the reach. Are you qualified? Here is a history of a wound. Somebody brought them, somebody bought them. Though I know who caught them, sold them, bought them. I'd rather focus on their faces, on their names. Those are the words of Jericho Brown upon arrivals, who reminds us of the millions and thousands of Black bodies, of Black souls that rest in the mud of the Atlantic because they gave up freedom to find freedom after death so that they would not be enslaved people on the Americas. Writer Nicole Hannah Brown speaks of other arrivals. She speaks of the Mayflower. The Mayflower, whose ship manifests, actually lists the names of self-prescribed pilgrims. Their narrative would be the narrative that would be celebrated countless decades and centuries, all rest in the children in education in America. Ms. Hannah Jones also reminds us of the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, who clearly suggested that this narrative was indeed propaganda, that there was yet another ship, as we may or may not know about, called the White Lion. The White Lion actually arrived the year before, 1619. Its passengers on the manifests only stated the names of the crew. The other humans on that ship were known as cargo, human cargo. There were no names listed. In fact, that ship raced to the shores of Virginia to quickly sell 20 of those human cargo so that they could recover some expenses they incurred along the way while they were pirating and stealing other bodies from yet another ship. Hannah, I want to call her Hannah Nicole, but anyway, Nicole Hannah Jones, she begs the question, what would America be without its Negro people? What say you, Kathryn Pope?
I love that question because it's something that throughout reading this book, I kept asking myself over and over again. That question, which is, America would not be what it is. And also, what would have happened if things had gone differently? If this story of the White Lion hadn't been repeated over and over and over again in different ways in the discrimination and brutality that Black Americans have faced throughout history.
It's really kind of a declaration that she says that this is where America began here in 1619. And one of our other writers in another essay declares this the birth of African America as we know it. In reference, in due diligence or to time, we're going to move into the Reconstruction period. So travel with us and just pretend that we've gone through this narrative of slavery. And now people are now free. They've endured whatever they had to endure. There were laws enacted, written and otherwise. But the 8 years we're about to talk about was known as the Reconstruction period in history, where, to give you some context, 2,000 Black men held elected positions in America. 2,000, local, state, federal. 2,000. We've passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. We now have the 14th Amendment that gives full citizenship to Black men. And we embarked upon the 15th Amendment to provide the opportunity to vote by Black men. Because of course, Black women were like white women, they could not vote. But during those 8 precious years, there was actually so much progress made for African Americans during that period. We even introduced the idea of public education. Why? Because white planters were able to send their children to private schools, and everyone benefited from, you know, the idea of public school introduced by Black people. So not only had we now been freed, but there was a special unit set up called the Freedmen's Bureau, which then was supported because not only with funds, but they had the backup of Union soldiers still present to help with the progress of Black people. Yet in 1870, there was a backroom deal done because there were just too many Black men able to vote in the South. Too many, you know, just too many. So this backroom deal allowed the flip, and you all know about the political flip where we go from Democrat to Republican, but this time the Democrats were what some of us might think as the GOP. No offense to anyone. But so they flipped. And this allowed the Union soldiers to be removed by the new administration. They decreased the funding, and the so-called Black codes sprang in or danced in to being known as the Jim Crow laws. Now, granted, everyone did not leave slavery. A lot of people stayed around. That's why you had those abundance of, you know, voting people. However, there were ways and means that people could be tricked by laws written or unwritten and killed. And this persisted every single day. There were lynchings upon lynchings upon lynchings, and there was simply terror going on from local municipality to municipality. And I love it that Michael Harriot called this the fairy tale, these 5 years that he wrote about of the 8 years of Reconstruction. He called it a fairy tale of liberty, justice for all, because that's what Black people thought. They believed in the words of the Constitution. They believed that what the law was the law, even though, as Kathryn and I were talking earlier today about the comma, there was always a comma and a but. We the people, but did not include Black people. What say you, Kathryn?
I love that you brought up the way Michael Harriot describes this time period. And he starts off by saying, what kind of story is this? And he calls it a war narrative, a horror story, a suspense thriller that ends in triumph and tragedy, a true story about a fantastic myth, and then the line that you brought up, a nonfiction account of the all-American fairy tale of liberty and justice for all. And then I love how he also asks the question, who is the hero? And the hero is all Black people. And I love how he says the hero of the story does not die ever and is indestructible. And then goes on to tell the story of the horrors of that time period and all the ways that I'm going to say white terrorists attacked people, prevented them from voting through violence, and the 3 acts of Congress that were put forth and completely ignored. Let's see, he describes it as a terrorist war designed to take away the power of Black people. And at the end of the essay, he says every imaginable monstrosity that evil can conjure has been inflicted on this population, yet they have not been extinguished. The hero remains still, and that is the most wondrous part of all. And that contextualizing of the story for me was carried me through. As I was reading the rest of the book, I thought about that over and over again, the hero of the story.
and still we rise.
Should we talk about the Harlem Renaissance?
Oh, please, my most favorite period, as Dr. Gills knows.
Why not you start us off?
Well, I'll put it in context again. You know what gains there were during Reconstruction. So now we've pushed to, through to the next, part of the beginning of the next century. So we've had the First World War. And after the war, in 1910, 1911, those early years, as our troops were returning home, there was egregious assaults on Black soldiers all over the country, to the point that we had something that was called the Red Summer. And that Red Summer was 10 plus cities where white race riots were held, where they burned and lynched Black men across the country. So every day there was a lynching of some kind going on. And so the powers that be, when I say the powers that be, I mean the Black leadership, W.E.B. Du Bois, Charles Johnson of the Urban League, and others were trying to find some kind of substantial way to prove to America that there was a new Negro, that Black people had progressed to the point that we could actually stand and contribute and be justified in receiving equal and full treatment under the so-called law. And so Du Bois, I would say probably more than anyone, felt that the creative pursuits would be the best channel for this. And since every major, organization of color, the NAACP, the Urban League, the Pullman Porter unions, they all had publications. And since radio was not such a big thing in every home, television wasn't here yet, the written word was the most communicative tool used. So people would hold on to these publications, newsletters, and these journals coming from these organizations. It was really how they were able to hold knowledge and get information for their daily lives and moving their communities forward. So Du Bois and these others felt like we could have a literary section in each of these journals that could promote this new Negro. And so they implored the younger creatives to please write about the lynchings, please write about the egregious acts that is being put upon the Negro in America. And of course, they were met with great resistance because these creative people did not want to give up their creative freedom to promote what they felt was propaganda, in a sense, to talk about the new Negro. They wanted to pursue their artistic freedoms. And so for me, the Harlem Renaissance was not just in Harlem per se. To me, the Harlem Renaissance was actually a movement, because people got these journals and these publications all over the country. And as Debbie Allen loves to say, honey, they point their toes in Houston, Texas too. So there were actually people writing, especially in Washington, D.C., where you had Howard University. People were writing all over and sending to these publications. And so that is how this whole movement was fueled. Certainly the music was slow coming because, you didn't have radio, or at least radio stations that were going to play the current jazz music or the blues and the musics of the time that were being produced out of African-American neighborhoods and communities. And of course, the visual artists got a little play because they could do the illustrations, their paintings and prints could be represented in these publications. And then once again, the dance, the creative dance was being utilized to tell the stories of our lives. Those could not be really widely distributed. So Harlem became this hub, this fuel. And even Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, who we often think were a big part of that, they didn't even live in Harlem at the time that is talked about in the book here. They came later. And when they did come, they were indeed the stars of the movement from the literary standpoint. And I know you want to talk about the fire. Let's talk about the fire. Tell me what the fire represented to you.
So the fire was that single issue that came out with so many writers of the time. And it only had one issue, but really made a difference in so many writers and so many people's lives. So, but as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself that this book, this essay talks about the importance of the arts and culture, and I think of this book that way too. In a way, it includes poetry, it includes essays, and I know there's no way that we could have asked people to read the entire book, but just the poetry that is included here to me reminds me of the energy of the Renaissance. And I'm thinking of, I know the next essay that's in the book that we were going to talk about is the Shelby ruling. But when we talk about the Renaissance, I think of the Black Lives Matter essay by Alicia Garza, because she talks about the time we're in now as a Black Renaissance. And I'm wondering what you think of that, Clarence?
Well, first of all, like I said, I really feel like the Harlem Renaissance was a movement. And so if you look at what's happening now, I mean, Black Lives Matter, the so-called organization, started in 2014 after the death of Trayvon Martin, because the wails, the moans, and the screams of Black mothers everywhere just, it just permeated people's souls, people's existence, knowing that Black children, Black men, Black women, really, the lives seemingly don't matter in America. So I think there was a pivot, unlike the civil rights movement. There was a pivot made where this so-called movement actually became a renaissance, because you had not only people taking to the streets, putting their bodies online around these just senseless deaths, but artists were starting to respond with their poetry, with their spoken word. Singers and entertainers were starting to write stories, and there was more film around these subjects. And so it has really become a renaissance bigger than just the political obvious implications. Yes.
I think something that I was surprised in this essay was she says that there were more protests in one year in 2014 than at any time during the civil rights era. And that was really surprising to me. And it made me think a lot about the times we're living in now and what they could mean for the future.
You mean
and something else, I'm sorry, Lisa.
So the year of 2014, more than total of all the protests in the civil rights. Wow.
That's what she said. Yeah.
Yeah. And think about it now. We have cell phones, cameras, we have multiple platforms on how to push forward the messaging and the messages from this movement. And so that also fueled what I believe is the Renaissance she's talking about.
Another thing that I thought was interesting, she talked about how Black Lives Matter was not led by traditional leaders who speak on behalf of activists, but the activists themselves. And then she talked about the power of storytelling. And Clarence and I were talking about this a lot earlier. She says storytelling is often connected to power and influence. And even today, the voices of activists in Ferguson from their own perspectives and viewpoints are too hard to come by and often eclipsed by those who want to center themselves within a story that's not their own. So that power of storytelling and what it means, I think it's really interesting that that's something that's consciously part of the Black Lives Matter movement.
And, I love the old African proverb that says, until the lion is able to tell his story, you will only know the story of the hunter. So in these times with this Black Lives Matter renaissance that we are upon, there's no way to now cover up, hide any of these stories. Everything is coming to the light. And that's the difference between the civil rights era and now. And yes, the organizers of Black Lives Matter did not want the SCLC style minister elders coming and telling them to go home and shut up and work through the system. No, it's about direct action. It's about time that, we not only remember that we make substantial changes right now in real time, And in real time, I just want to jump back to Shelby ruling, if I may, Kathryn, because even though it parallels two different voter suppression scenarios of Otis Moss and the other gentleman in a later time. The interesting thing is, we right now in real time, we have over 147 laws, state laws that have passed legislatures across the country right now, suppressing votes, turning everything back beyond the Voters' Rights Act. So we are actually right now part of the return or the turn back or the extinguishing of rights of Black people in America, because Black people have always held, and in the book you will see this quote, that Black people held the sacred right to vote as being sacred. And they did hold on to those words of the Constitution, believing that they were part of we the people.
I know we were talking about this before, the story of Eddie Lee Holloway, and that took place in Wisconsin. I was born in Wisconsin, and the description of what Mr. Holloway experienced when trying to vote in Wisconsin in 2016 after the new voter ID law is particularly chilling to me. And as they say in the essay, that according to one study, there were 200,000 votes that were suppressed in that year. And in Wisconsin, Trump won by only 22,748 votes. And I remember this well because maybe because I was born in Wisconsin, but it was the last state, the final state that went red in that election. And thinking about all the ways that the 1965 Voting Rights Act is kind of being disassembled and dismantled in front of us in 2021 is, I want to say it's a moment that I hope will make many of us move and take action. I'm pausing for you, Clarence. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what perplexes me is the simple thought that we have called ourselves a republic that believes that voting is essential for a democracy. And yet, we're in the 21st century, and throughout time, there's been this movement to extinguish that right for all people. And here we are sitting, watching this take place in real time for those of us who are paying attention. So I just wonder where it's going to lead us in the future if we don't try to do something about it. I mean, obviously there are people like Stacey Abrams who are trying to work fundamentally on the ground to circumvent the results of those laws. But, I just don't know if every municipality and every place is trying to do that. And Kathryn, I just want to jump back to the Reconstruction essay.
I was just going to say that.
I was going to bring up my hometown because of all of those gains during Reconstruction for Black people in elected positions. I grew up near Wilmington, North Carolina. And of course, in the Reconstruction chapter, it talks about how the Ku Klux Klan were able to basically reverse the entire government of North Carolina. Basically, you put everybody out of office and put their own people in and start over and all of that. And in Wilmington, where I grew up, and it's also the home of Michael Jordan, there were over 370 some people killed, fleeing for their lives, running into the Cape Fear River to hide. They burned down the local Black newspaper, and they put all the Blacks out of office. They put all of the state government officers out of office, and nobody talked about it. My mother taught North Carolina history, and I did not know this story until last year after George Floyd. And I was so incensed, like you, not to know that something so relevant happened in my hometown. I didn't have my parents to call on, so I called on an older cousin who's a retired sheriff. And I said, do you know anything about this? He said, of course, yes. I said, well, but why doesn't everybody know about this? And I learned that, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, when they burned down half the city among all its Black residents, that they didn't talk about it because they were afraid of retribution, afraid of it happening again. So all that information, all the archives and all that story is locked under key at the city library.
So this is something we talked about earlier, but these two essays for me echo each other, or I should say the Shelby essay echoes the Reconstruction, in that it's a similar thing is happening again and again, and it's following the pattern of the what did Garza calls it the backlash. So there's some gains main, and then there's a backlash. And I couldn't help but read this essay and Our Time Now in a similar way, that we're having a backlash. And as I was reading this book, there were so many things I know we don't have time to bring up, where I realized that my own education of history missed so much of what happened in America, and how I was taught as somebody who's white to kind of divorce myself from the ugliest parts of history, and how that's really that's caused so many problems for me personally, and also for, I think, for everyone, that's a thing that happens. I think one of the speakers in the last Messy Conversations mentioned that too, that that kind of divorcing from history as I have no way to end that sentence, as problematic is what I want to say, but it's such a word that means so much less than I want it to mean. And I know we're running out of time. I'll pass it back to you, Clarence.
But it's also an erasure. You know, it's purposeful and it's necessary, because America, she does not want to feel guilt. She does not want to hold on to the truth in any form. So it's perpetual. It will continue as a cycle until it is changed. And I have to say, as a Black man in America, we're talking about history. Every chance I get, I'm very grateful to learn something new. And through even the exploration of this book, I've learned new facts that I did not know, you know, even starting with the arrivals. I did not know the White Lion had pirated and stolen other slaves, other Africans, to enslave them, to bring them to the shores of Virginia on that trip. I did not know that until this reading, you know, but there's so many hidden facts. Just think about it. You know, now we have cell phones and videotapes and all kinds of platforms, but all of the egregious things that happened across the country in the cover of night will never be known in the cover of day. So we just have to stand strong. As the old folks in the Black church, they stand in the gap and just welcome, you know, a change. A change got to come, and no, we have not overcome, and but we want to. Is that you, David?
So I want to thank Kathryn and Clarence for that rather stunning overview of those 5 chapters. Wow. And I want to remind everyone, if you have some questions or comments that you'd like to make, if you could throw them in the chat, it helps us kind of organize the rest of our time. And there's a couple in there that I want to get to. I'm going to take advantage of where I'm sitting and ask you the first question. I was really impressed with the selections that you made. I thought the arrival, Reconstruction, Harlem Renaissance, suppression of voting rights, and the Black Lives Matter hung together just brilliantly. I loved that. And so I want to ask each of you.
Let me just say this, David.
Yo.
Let me just say, we chose these chapters under duress. We had not read the book at all. And just off the top of our heads, we rattled those chapters off under duress to Jackie and Dr. Gills or whoever asked us for them initially. But here is the most profound and prophetic thing that occurred. I went back and listened to, Dr. Gill sent us a tape. It's an interview of Kendi and also of Dr. Blain. And the facilitator asked them what they felt the most important chapters were. And they named all of the same chapters except for Reconstruction. And I gagged when I saw that. I shared that with Kathryn earlier today. I said, I can't believe we chose the same chapters that they said they thought were important. So anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut your question off. Go ahead with your question.
No, that's even more impressive. And yeah, I really just was blown away at how the selections that you made and how they wove together. What I'd like to ask each of you is, you know, these authors cover 4 to 5 year periods of history. It ends in 2019. If you were invited to write the next chapter, the 2019-2023 chapter, what do you think you'd be writing about?
Oh my God, it would have to be the post-mortem of the Orange Agent, the fallout from George Floyd, the 147 different attempts to purge voter registration, the rise of white supremacy. It would be those things for me.
I agree. And before Clarence and I were talking about this, the pattern that we saw throughout the book of gains and then pushback and similar things happening under different names over and over and over again. And I would imagine to see, this sounds really cynical, but I imagine to see similar patterns repeated with different names. But my hope is, and I keep coming back to that line, Lisa, that you asked about the number of protests happening in 2014. My hope is that with more and more voices, maybe things would shift a little bit.
Thank you both so much. So mining our chat, I come up with a couple of things thus far. Continue to encourage you to post in the chat. But Felicia Jones had a comment. She didn't have a question, but a comment in Felicia about technology and documentation of resistance and injustice. Felicia, would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, I had a conversation. I'm from Boston originally, and I grew up in a time where it was a lot of racial tension, and when busing was originally integrated in. And so and being a very fair-skinned Black person, but both my parents are Black, and my mother was part of Martin Luther King's resistance and a lot of things going on at that time. But so my children did not grow up in that time, and they very integrative, and they grew up in a very privileged lifestyle. So trying to let them understand what happened for Black people during the time of my era. So I was very interested to see, they didn't want to hear a lot about the struggle of Black people and what has happened. So they were very resistant towards that. And it just always troubled me not to want them to know about their history or what happened in Black history. And so it didn't, and up until this time where the struggle and violence and everything in the world happened, where they had to kind of face this, and around the world that it came up, where they had to face this challenge. And it always, so my daughter it was like, Mom, it had, the world is changing, and it, around the world is changing. And it was young people that stepped up into this new light to bring this about. So, it often wonders when I say, let me just stop chattering and trying to stop being politically correct and holding my tongue, because this is the issue. when I love history. I love history because history repeats itself and it shows its face constantly. But what I'm saying is that, especially for older people, we know that we've seen history happen in the different languages and the different ways, right? But what I do see today, what happened with technology around the world, what made the difference, what happened now that ignited like fire, was that technology, was the young people getting out. And in every movement that ever has happened was young people in their 20s out on the front lines, making a stand and making their voices heard. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to bring to this older group and this challenge, is that around the world, it wasn't just in the United States. It couldn't just be shushed here. It happened everywhere, and it shamed us everywhere. So I wanted to bring that to the platform and say, what did you think about that platform in terms of race relations?
Well, I personally think that, I made comment on this earlier, that because technology is such, the world saw a modern day lynching in broad daylight in America because of a cell phone and because of a video camera, a body cam. So there's no denying the existence of what has been going on, as I said earlier, under the cover of night, and away from the cameras. This has persisted. That now there's an awakening, yes, with younger people, that they don't have to walk around and say, oh, I don't want to see that movie because it's about slavery and I don't want to know nothing about slavery. And, I regale in that, we don't seem to get ever tired of seeing another movie on the Holocaust. And, I've kind of myself been attracted as of late to all of these backstories, even through the element of food, tracing people's heritage and ethnicities and histories through food. Just watching this month alone, the Asian Pacific Islander history, heritage, and all the things that we were never told in anybody's history book. Not only relationships, but the treatment, the treatment of the Chinese, the treatment of the Japanese people in America has been, egregious, almost to the point of slavery, So it's been a perpetual, continuous behavior that America has practiced since she landed on these shores. So it's always going to be repeated, because until she can, Kathryn and I were both in the department, in the Department of Urban Sustainability. So we talk about the enclosure of power. So this power that's been enclosed in America, where America feels that they can just be and do and treat people any way they want to for the sake of gain, it's going to continue until we have systemic changes. So yes, technology has ignited younger people to be not afraid anymore to look back and wonder, as the old folks say, and to have that Sankofa moment where we have to look back to know where we can go.
But it's almost one step, if I could just add this other caveat, it's like the trauma, we're in a state of trauma, right? And we're thinking about mental health and how mental health is impacting. It's not just, we're not just digesting this. These are traumatic, serious, traumatic moments that are not just on the surface, but in the deep part of the spirit, right? In the core essence of who we are. And it's not something that just rolls over and you just, roll out of it and just say, okay, well, this is when George Floyd was on that mama, I was paralyzed. I didn't just go to work and just say, never mind. It's the end of that. I have a son, I have a daughter, I'm a Black mother. But I was traumatized. It lasted and it's still lasting. And then the more I watch the news, the more my kids, all the women in Black families and communities, 9/11, when I saw the Korean woman and the abuse and these things, these egregious acts that continue to traumatize our communities, Islamic, Muslims, it doesn't matter which one, it's one after another. When the ISIS people, it doesn't matter whatever the ethnic group it is in the Americas, it's a traumatic event when we are all minorities being accosted. But it's just pitted against one group against another group. But as a Black American, we are always at this 400 years of accosted, assaulted population, but we're also to be docile. And it's a painful act. And so those are the kind of things that we have to always work through. And that's hard. It's a very hard position to be in on a regular basis. And so these are the kind of things that we have to, when we see Black men paint. And if you ever get a chance, Station 19 did a phenomenal episode about 2 weeks ago. If you get a chance to watch it, there was a great episode. I would actually watch this because you get to see the Black professional men, firefighters, as well as the mother. The writer did an amazing job. Episode was amazing to watch, but you can feel the pain of everybody in the process that they all went through. Amazing.
Yeah, when we talk about trauma, I love that in one of the essays, it talks about how the Black soul has inherited from the ancestors the element of resistance. That is why we cannot die. That is why we cannot be killed, because those people who gave up their lives on the White Lion and the people that landed on the shores, they passed on not simply that trauma, but the power of resistance.
Felicia, I don't know if you'd like to put the episode that you were referencing in the chat so other people can find it. And Kathryn, do you want to weigh in response to Felicia?
I had a thought before that last little bit, but I think the conversation has changed a bit. I was thinking about what initially you said about technology, and I was reminded about what Clarence said when talking about the Harlem Renaissance, that people shared published material, and I thought of today the sharing of material is so much swifter and easier, and it seems to go farther. And I had some hope with that thought. But in your discussion of the pain and just the weight of it all, especially as someone who's white, I think it's important for me to hear that and feel that, and I don't necessarily have anything that can add to that, I guess.
Thank you, Kathryn. Lisa, not to put you on the spot, but you've commented a couple times, and one of which was specifically on the voting rights restrictions in Republican states. Would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, that's happening everywhere, and has support by Republican voters. And also just it's interesting what's happening in Tulsa, the recognition of the massacre, as they are banning the study of Black history in schools. And that cynicism is just, it's upsetting. And as Clarence and Kathryn were saying, it's also not new. And just, I think that's what reading gives us. It reminds us and it brings back. And that's one way, Clarence, when you're talking about the ancestors, I think reading is a way to make people present and old stories present again for us. And I just so appreciate how you both, like David said, talked about these readings in ways that were just really fresh. And I thank you. Thank you for what you chose and how you talked about their words today.
Either of you care to expand on Lisa's comments?
Oh, I'm just enthusiastic that you mentioned the how how reading can change things and change our perspective of things.
Right, and you have to also realize that for a very long time, it was against the law for Black people to learn to read. And that said, there are lots of books that never quite make it, to Amazon. There are lots of books that never quite make it onto the library shelves or into depositories of research. So as, I guess, critical thinkers, we have to go beyond, the normal means if we really want to dig deeper into some of these historical accounts and into all of those measures of history that have been simply erased purposefully.
Thank you. I'm going to make another appeal to anyone who wants to get something into the chat. As I was listening to the conversation, especially as it emerged between Felicia and Clarence, and I hear like two notes that come together, and I find these over and over again in my reading of Black history and Black lives, and it's Felicia speaking so beautifully about the trauma of this, and then and many people just not wanting to engage that, like enough's enough, let us live our lives, that's old-timey stuff, whatever that is. And then Clarence beautifully pairing that with the second note, which is resilience, and the connection between those two in Black culture and experience. I don't know if either Clarence or Kathryn would like to say anything about that to take us on up to 5 o'clock.
I'll defer to the great woman from the state of Wisconsin.
Like, that's not me, right?
Yes.
I as you're talking, David, I keep coming back to the Michael Harriot's description in Reconstruction of the hero, and that his description, I think, includes both of those elements. The hero does not die ever, and the hero has also been through, I'm just going to say, multiple terrorist wars, and that's just something I kept coming back to as I was reading this book and in this conversation in my mind too.
I was bringing up to Kathryn in a previous conversation about something I saw on the internet. They were showing this woman who was crying, and she was crying because she had tried to buy a home, and everyone realizes the economic gap between Black people and white people in this country, and how the Great New Deal and the GI Bill and all the things that were put in place to grow the middle class were never meant for us. The gerrymandering, the gentrification, all of it is purposeful. But she had a white friend to go and inquire about the same property, and the value went from what she was told to 3 times more in terms of the equity value of that property. And she sobbed because she thought we'd gone beyond predatory lending, but yet here we are, 2021, and we're still the victim of that. So, the only thing I can say is, to Kathryn's point, it is continuous, it repeats itself, and unless we can simply stop and pay attention, I mean, the kids say, let's stay woke. We really have to pay attention. We are critical thinkers, at least in this learning community. And we have to encourage our, networks and our people around us and our, families to pay attention. Every word is not written, everything is not always said. And sometimes we need to look at what we're not seeing as opposed to what we see.
Thank you so much. If you're new to Messy Conversations, we try to wrap up around 5 o'clock, but then, we hang out for another 20, 30 minutes for a more informal conversation. So we encourage you to stay with us for that if you don't have to go. I hope that the conversation so brilliantly handled between Clarence and Kathryn inspires you, if you haven't yet read 400 Souls, to start to dig into it. It's an extraordinary book. It's a large volume, but it's broken up into these nice small pieces that you can read easily throughout the weeks. So I encourage you to do that. Please remember that we have an extra special Messy Conversation Friday. We've never had one on Friday before. We have one this Friday, 4 o'clock, to begin to try to better understand and figure out how we can support Palestinians and that movement and what's going on in that part of the world, and connect that with exactly the conversations we've been having for this past year around Black lives and racial injustice here in our own country. Bring a friend. It's 2 for 1 Fridays. Drive safely and get home safely. And if you can hang out, hang out. Big round of applause to Kathryn and Clarence.
Well, I would like to say I love Mark's comment about cancer culture being part of how and why history is being erased currently. I don't know if you saw that in the chat, David.
I was that came at the very end, and I didn't see it. So thank you for pointing that out.
And if I could just say, I think Jacqueline Rose is speaking to that it is still with us, as it fits with Kathryn's comments too, that, you know, it's again and again and again. So history helps guide us into what we're still facing, sadly, but brilliant job, folks. Thank you so much.
I've never heard such a pregnant pause on Messy Conversation. What are people thinking?
I'm starting to see a few things roll in. Jacqueline's got some stuff. Sarah Beth has some things. And I hope Kathryn and Clarence, you saw all the love you were getting in the chat. People really appreciated the extraordinary job you did. But Jacqueline or Sarah Beth, you want to jump in on that?
I just had a question because so much information is coming out right now, and I just wanted the two of you to guess, you know, after reading the book and after reading the information, what do you think not inspired them to write this book, but what do you think of the writer's perspective of taking this moment to put this information in our hands, and what do you expect what would you guess would happen to it? Because it's not necessarily you've exposed a history book. It's also a social statement. It's not propaganda, but it's something more. It's something much, much more. So can you both address that aspect of it?
Well, I was talking to Kathryn earlier today about the intention of this book. And that's why I'm so grateful Dr. Gill's passed out that, was shared rather, the interview of the writers of that interview that she shared. And, you know, they explain the approach and why it was done. And it was really to commemorate the 400 years of Africans in America from 1619 forward. That was the intention, and this was pre-George Floyd, of course. And so different people were creating different tribute pieces for 1619's anniversary, 400th anniversary, as did, you know, Nicole Hannah Jones with her 1619 project and the New York Times, which does a different kind of job, but yet the end result or the telling of the so-called truth still is the same with both of these works, with this book and with the 1619 project. And that is everything that has gone forward derived from 1619. And I had to remind myself, and actually it was a nice reminder within the book, that we were here, we being African people were already here when, Columbus discovered America. There's a wonderful book, Dr. Gills, who's the author of They Came Before the Mayflower? Was that Leroy Bennett?
Bennett.
It was Leroy.
Lerone Bennett.
Lerone Bennett, yes. In his book, it talks about, that, African people were already here. I mean, certainly a lot of us came to the back door through Mexico. The Moors, dominated Spain. I love that when David always says, we need to talk about what happened in the 14th to 15th centuries and how that relates to now and to American history, because it's all necessary to understand how we all got here. And so that kind of spun the purpose behind this book. What I hope will happen is that this book is used by institutions like ours, maybe in Ed Found and other situations, where it can be dissected and studied on a broader basis, maybe even along with the 1619 curriculum or even the 1619 project as it's laid out by those writers, because those writers were selected to write about a certain kind of period. And also, to further answer your question, I also said to Kathryn earlier, I really wish I knew what the parameters were that Kendi and Blain told these writers, because they didn't know who was in the book with them. They knew that their instructions were to write 5 years of this period. So they didn't know how their piece was going to connect with the previous 5 years or the latter 5 years. And I said to Kathryn, I also wish I knew the questions that they were asked to answer within their written pieces. And how none of them knew actually who was in the book until the galley print came out. So
that's really interesting, Clarence.
There's great questions from Sarah Beth, from Asa, from Kirsten.
I'm not sure I had a question. I just, Clarence, when you were talking about the ongoing lynchings of Black men, and I was thinking about what it would have been like at home for women of all kinds. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about how people would explain to their children, where is everybody going? What are they doing? I was thinking to myself, what did white children understand about what their parents were involved in? And how were they explaining it? Were they explaining it? I imagine they would have been. And yet, to talk to any of my relatives who still knew those older generations before they passed, they never would speak of that stuff, and still won't speak of it. And that was part of my thought about that, and also the complexity of replacing social communities that people use to do business and to connect with each other and to keep their privilege sustainable, so to speak. Like, all of those mechanisms have shifted to this social media world, and yet the supremacy and the privilege have stayed relatively stable. And I think that speaks to many things, but I just all of these incredibly difficult ideas that you illuminated, both of you, and certainly the book does an incredible job with. It's a lot, and I appreciate so much what you said, Felicia, about what you're carrying. And yeah,
if I can just share just a little bit. I mean, in Boston, I mean, even to this very day, Boston is still very racially divided. It's very racially divided. And I remember in California, when I first came here, I was very surprised about the Black community and about the white, like everybody was like so blended, and I was so shocked, and I didn't understand, like when I came here, that people didn't understand, like they were like, why, I was confused when I came here, but yet I could see racism, I could see it clearly, but people here didn't understand that it was tension here, and yet and when I had my mother's friends that was from Canada, and they were white, and their kids were biracial, and there was some other issues, and yet there was still things that I noticed, and we were living in Hollywood at that time, and so one of the things that there's a sense of an entitlement conversation that happens, that even though you want to be included and you want to understand, there's still things that even though I might be light and very fair-skinned, there are things that you might say in my presence that still that are offensive, because you still think that you don't understand, right? I am Black. My mother's Black, my father's Black, and I am Black. So there, it's just, I was chased at 8 years old by a Ford 250 truck with white men in it as a child. My school bus was tipped over. My friends' eyes were put out by integration at a school bus. These are things that would never be scorned. But when white children were in our school in Boston, the Black families or elders in my community did not try to kill the little white kids. So you understand what I'm saying? So there's a difference between older white Black families, what happened with the respect for children versus what happened for children in white communities and Black communities. But that's not what we're trying to say here. What I'm saying is that when you talk about this conversation that happens when we have to talk to children or talk to our families, there's a dissonance that happens in a conversation for entitlement. See, I still believe that there's something of a blame that happens when it comes to talking about what for Black children. When we have there's something that they did wrong, or there's something that caused that condition for them versus what we have. We belong here. And there's something that they did to cause, they must have done something to make that happen to them, because it wouldn't have happened otherwise. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's always, it's very hard. I mean, my son-in-law is white, and when we had that same conversation, they live up in Oregon, and his family is white, and we had to have the same conversation. I was like, you understand, you married a Black woman, although she's fair-skinned. My grandchildren will still be biracial, Black in heritage. Mm-hmm. And we had to have these conversations. It's very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Sarah Beth, I want to jump back to your earlier part about, the lynching and how the conversations are held with children. I just want to point out two things. Back in the early 1900s, lynchings were like entertainment. That's why there were so many of them. I mean, yes, there were egregious ones where, like in Elaine, Arkansas, 241 families of children and wives and husbands and farmers and sharecroppers were hung because they just wanted a fair wage with sharecropping. And the white community stood around and regaled in these hangings, these lynchings, and they even took pieces of body parts or pieces of clothing as souvenirs. This went on forever. And the mere fact that just last year, the lynching bill was passed last year, and every year in Congress since the late 1800s, they've been asking for a law against lynchings. Lynchings still happen. I said earlier, I grew up in Southern North Carolina, and just not even 13 miles from my father's door, there was a lynching just 2 years ago. A young man, 18 years old, about to start a new job, everything going for him. However, he was engaged to be married to a white 35-year-old woman, and he was found hanging in broad daylight in a playground. So it's still going on. And I don't know what those conversations are with Black or white families. I just know that it's still happening. And I think that's why the technology allowed the world to see a modern day lynching in broad daylight from a cell phone and a video camera.
Thank you, Clarence.
Can I add something? Earlier, Clarence and I were talking about, I was bringing up reading this book as a white woman and noticing the many ways that white women were used as kind of levers of white supremacy, specifically when it came to lynchings with false accusations, and how that was not only something that happened, but it was something that was institutionalized in a way. It was something that was systematically put into place. And there were so many instances in this book where I noticed that happening again and again, with different systematic ways to continue brutalizing Black people.
I did notice that with this book more than almost all the others that I've read in the last year, that this book, without the conversation, it does something different in my white body. And so that's what I was speaking to when I heard you, Clarence, saying that, like the images were coming, and it was very different than when I was reading this by myself at home. And I appreciate so much that we can have a space to do this. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sarah Beth. And you know, I like what you saying there at the very end. To me, it's so far, I haven't gotten through the whole thing, but so far it's been like stumbling upon like a literary album of a family history. And there's an intimacy to it that's just breathtaking. As well as the historical. Asa's got a great question about arts and culture in social justice. If you're there, Asa, would you like to come on in?
Sure, I am here. Yeah, I mentioned that I love that Clarence started us off with some song, and we had some poetry included in the selections, and then also the small bit on the Harlem Renaissance. And so just noticing the prevalence and the power of art, of creativity, of artistic expression as a thread throughout the readings. And if either of you, both of you could speak to kind of how you see the role of art, of music in this 400 Souls story.
Well, I was laughing with Kathryn earlier today. I was sharing with her just how profoundly spooked I was, literally spooked, because beyond just going back and watching the video, the interview with the authors, I went back and reread in its entirety the introduction to the book, which talked about the souls of Black people and how the narrative should really be sung, as a choir of souls. And I had already decided that I was going to open up with a Negro spiritual and the poem, never having known that that was written in the book. And so when I shared that with Kathryn today, we both had to laugh and talk about the complete synchronicity of every choice we've made for today. But in reference to your actual question, Nina Simone often says it is the responsibility of an artist to talk about the times, the present times, the times you're living in. So I think that that's why they felt it necessary to include poets, because sometimes the hard edges are softened by poetic language and by rhythm. You know, they took away the drum, but people kept still dancing. They kept moving. They kept expressing themselves. And people in the dance world, they have always said that dance was, of course, the language of the silent ones. And dance tells a story, and music does the same thing. And we all know that the whole idea of visual arts certainly connects us to a reality as well as to an impressionistic fantasy if necessary to explore certain subject matters and certain pieces of reality. So that's my take on it, Kathryn.
As you asked that question, Asa, I kept thinking about what Sarah Beth just said about feeling this book in your body differently than others. And if I had to guess, it might be the poetry and the beauty of the writing, the artistic elements of the book, I think carried a lot of emotions with it. And for me, at least. And there were moments as I was reading where I just had to like pause and just like feel it for a while. And I think that says a lot about what each writer who participated in the book accomplished in their work.
We'll play on the word pause there. And first, thank Jacqueline for pointing out that Seraphil's trying to get in. He wants to talk about pauses.
Thank you, David. Hi, KP and Clarence. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's really, it's just great, and I'm excited about reading the book. But Clarence mentioned at the end of the conversation earlier that there was a silence, and I could feel that silence in my own throat. So that's why I just wanted to speak to it, because it's something that we're reading history. We're still in the history. This is not over. We're not talking about something that is completely done with, and we're just reflecting on it. We're actually still experiencing it. So that's why we're all choking, because we don't know how to cut through it, you know? And a few interesting things about language I think about, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, is I trained myself for a long time to say enslaved people instead of slaves. And I think another phrase that I struggle with in these conversations is white supremacy, because I think it's the idea of white supremacy. It's not the actual reality of white supremacy. So I don't know what thoughts there are on that already, or what people have on that here. And since I have the mic, I'm just gonna say one more thing that was also sitting with me, is around, which I think was a profound question that Sarah Beth asked, was like, what did people tell their children? Because the reality is that we all die. So the only thing that can exist is ideas that we pass on. So what we tell our children is very powerful. And, you know, I grew up in Ethiopia. We were still are able to kill our own sheep and chicken if we choose to. As a child, I enjoyed watching that, you know. It was gruesome, it was scary, but it was also like, this is the way we do things. And I think even though I wasn't there in the early history of this country, and unfortunately still existing, that is the way this country lives, is by killing Black people. And so I think children get used to seeing that. They get used to seeing that it's okay, which is really, it's a way of desensitizing. So yeah, I'm gonna pause on that.
You've unpacked a lot, but I just want to quickly respond to something that was found in the text of the book. When you speak of, you know, living right now in the history, one of the writers, and Kathryn, help me out, you know, your memory is better than mine, but one of the writers said that the past is near. The past is near. So if we're looking back at history, it's actually right here with us, because we are reliving all of that. And yes, it's not so much that America likes to kill Black men or Black people. America needs someone to be less than so that she can be superior. That's where the whole idea of supremacy comes from. someone must be less so that someone can be more. So, you know, just like it was the Irish, you know, people were persecuted as the less than white person during the early stages of America beyond slavery. And yes, to your point about the Africans, I mean, the people coming kidnapped to America were Africans who were enslaved. So it is indeed the enslaved Africans. And that is, I'm told, is the proper way to say it, because we did not arrive here as slaves. We came here as architects, as scientists, as doctors, as veterinarians, like my great-great-grandfather who was enslaved. You know, we came here with skills and professions that we were already in a civilized nation dealing with. We also came with our own religions, many multiple thoughts, depending on where you came from in Africa. Like the first people that were described on the white lion actually came from Angola. So depending on where you came from is what you brought with you. So yes, if you came here killing sheep, you know, and feeding your family, et cetera, my great-grandfather was the most celebrated veterinarian without a license that every plantation wanted to come and heal their animals. He was also a very proficient and talented blacksmith who got pushed into another situation to be a breeder, to actually make babies with 6 women in a house. But they were all Africans who were enslaved.
Thank you, Clarence. And thank you, Serafel, for your comments and questions. Our dear Kirsten, who's in her penultimate messy conversation, has some questions and comments about the erasure of stories of brutality.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Kathryn and Clarence, for a really astonishing exchange that has been so affecting for everyone here. And I appreciated the way in which the sequence began with the piece by Nicole Hannah-Jones and her emphasis on this erasure of the we could call it the non-dominant story, the alternative story, the exceptionalism story, and then there's the story of the crime, the original crime that got erased, and setting the stage for the erasure of all of the subsequent crimes that followed from that. And my impression from her writing is that we can't make progress as a society toward racial justice until we recognize this part of our story. We white people, the white society, the perpetrator society, needs to come to terms with this. And I keep asking myself, well, how do we get these blinders off? How do we get the blind spots removed? People are cling to them, and the sort of white supremacy, white nationalism that we see today is a manifestation of the determination not to know what happened, and continues to happen. So I don't know whether this is a question. I mean, this is what perplexes me, and I've been thinking about this, especially since seeing the series by Raoul Peck, the Exterminate All the Brutes, which posited that the readiness, the willingness to exterminate people who get in your way is the foremost tool of white supremacy. And so these are the things that I'm thinking about in response to this conversation and in response to the text, especially the Nicole Hannah Jones. And also, I would say the one who wrote about the fairy tale of liberty and justice. That follows, you know, when you erase the real story, then you have to make up a fairy tale. And at least half of the United States is in the grip of a fairy tale. More, probably. Okay, that's it.
You know, the interesting thing for me is I go back to that interview, and I'm sure that a lot of you have already seen that interview with the two authors, but the facilitator, whose name escapes me, I don't know, Dr. Gill, if you remember the facilitator's name, but she is indeed from England. And in that conversation, she reminded us that, you know, England is a very small country. So how did she manage to colonize all these places? And I asked that question when I was a kid. I wanted to know, well, how did they get the people from Africa? How did they just go and, you know, kill the people and kidnap them? And the adult looked at me and said, guns. So it is totally by violence that the British, and I'm speaking only about the British were able to come to the Americas, pillage, rape, and murder indigenous people, and then kidnap another group of people, bring them here, and abuse them to fuel an economic power engine so that they could satisfy their greed. And it's just perpetual. So it's almost like follow the money. You know, you go back and follow, how did these colonizing forces come to be? And that behavior has simply, you know, been perpetual. And the other thing that this facilitator said, and I was really not aware of this, even though in my own personal research, especially around reparations, I realized in one of the papers I wrote, and Kathryn, you know this from one of my papers, that I wrote about how the first reparations post-slavery in America went to the planters, to the actual masters, the slaveholders. And I did not realize that England took out loans to compensate all of these slaveholders for the loss of their slaves after the Civil War. We know that Lincoln went about the border states and he gave X number of dollars to, you know, slaveholders at the end of the Civil War. But I didn't know that England had actually gone into debt, you know, to compensate the slaveholders. And they just paid off that money. She said, I believe she said 2 years ago. 2 years ago. So in the 21st century, from what is it, 1865 to now, it took them that long to pay off the debt from paying for all of those slaves.
I just wanted to share an image that came to my mind, Kirsten, while you were talking about the erasure. I think of like old school chalkboards and the erasers that we used to have to clap to clean. And I just imagine, as Clarence calls America she, I imagine America walking on a chalkboard and then erasing behind as she walks, because we're still in it and it's still being erased as it's happening. Just what happened with the Capitol and the stories that are now being told about January 6th, erasing what happened that we all saw not too long ago. So I think, yeah, it's I continually don't have a way to answer to end my sentences, but I think it's happening again.
I recognize, oh, go ahead, Kirsten.
I just wanted to say to Kathryn, that's a really good example of how the erasure is continuing today, and at what peril it is for our whole country that we can't look squarely at what happened, or a significant portion of our society cannot look squarely and will not. And, well, you know, has to promote some alternative version of what happened.
I want to thank everybody who has,
Into class, so I beg you guys to forgive me. I've got to for the first time, run to class. So thank you all for inviting us and allowing us to do what we're able to do.
thank you, Clarence. I want to thank everybody who has participated in any way in this messy conversation. There's lots of resources in the chats, and so take a look at those. Special thanks, of course, to Kathryn and Clarence again for just a brilliant job. And please don't forget the extra special messy conversation coming up this Friday, 4 o'clock. Same Zoom link will get you here. Flyers will be going out. There's one in the chat. More will be coming to your email inbox. And yeah, just thank all of you. Brilliant conversation.